August 15th, 2022, as fireworks lit up the skies across India, celebrating 75 years of independence, something else was happening quietly. Away from the crowds, a government panel signed the freedom of 11 convicted men. These men were not political prisoners. They were murderers and rapists, convicted of crimes so brutal they had once shocked the conscience of the entire nation. And yet, they were handed freedom, garlanded, celebrated, as if they had done something noble. Among the millions who watched in horror was Bilkis Bano. 20 years earlier, she had survived the unthinkable. She had lost everything: her child, her family, her innocence. Now, watching her attackers walk free, forced to relive her worst memories, was like being wounded all over again. But to truly understand the weight of that moment, we have to go back to the beginning, to the day her life and the soul of a nation were forever scarred. March 3rd, 2002. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Homes had already been burned to the ground. Entire village emptied. Fear clung to every wall and every whisper. Bilkis Bano, 5 months pregnant, held her 2 young nieces tightly. Her family, 17 of them, had left their village, Radhikapur, days earlier, praying the violence wouldn't catch up. They had no destination, only the desperate hope that somewhere, anywhere, might be safe. They took shelter near a small hamlet called Chapawad. For a heartbeat, they thought they'd cheated mortality, but safety was an illusion. That afternoon, a group of men, 20, maybe 30, found them. These were familiar faces, neighbors they had once shared meals with. Without warning, the group descended. Screams tore through the fields, but no one came. Bilkis watched, powerless, as her family was dragged apart. Her 3-year-old daughter, Saleha, clung to her dress, crying, pleading. Bilkis tried to shield her, but they wrenched the child from her arms. She barely had time to scream before she was struck to the ground. What happened next would fracture her world into before and after. She was raped again and again under the open sky, her body battered, her mind numb with terror. Around her, her mother, sisters, nieces, all suffered the same fate. And when they could no longer hear the screams, when there was nothing left but silence, the men left them for dead. Time passed. Day turned into night without anyone noticing. Bilkis fought to move. Her body is broken, her spirit, battered but unbroken, refused to surrender. She dragged herself across the cold ground, searching for someone, anyone still breathing. Saleha, her little girl, was gone. Struck against a rock, her tiny life extinguished. Bilkis was left alone in a world emptied of meaning and mercy, and yet, from the ruins of her broken world, something raw and bold rose within her. She would not be silent. She would fight, even if the fight cost her everything. The morning after the attack, Bilkis Bano walked barefoot through the wreckage. Her body barely obeyed her. Every step, a prayer not to fall. Every breath, a reminder she was still alive when so many were not. Somewhere behind her, the bodies of her mother, her sisters, her daughter Saleha lay still. She couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She reached the nearest police station, clothes torn, bruises covering her skin, grief trailing behind her like smoke. She begged them, pleaded with the officers to listen. They made her wait. Hours passed. When they finally spoke to her, they scribbled a few lines into a dusty ledger. They didn't record the rape. They didn't name the attackers, even though Bilkis had recognized them. They told her quietly, "It's better if you stay silent." She was just 21, alone, pregnant, hunted not only by the men who attacked her, but by a system that didn't want to hear her story. In those early days, survival itself felt like rebellion. Every door she knocked on, every official she begged, treated her suffering like a stain they wanted scrubbed away. At times, she wondered if she was invisible. A ghost, wandering through offices, courtrooms, waiting rooms, carrying her broken story in hands no one wanted to touch. But Bilkis somehow refused to disappear. Word spread, first in whispers, then in louder voices. Human rights activists learned her name. Journalists started asking questions no one wanted to answer. News reports, first local, then national, began to shine a weak, flickering light into the darkness. Under mounting pressure, the case was finally handed to the Central Bureau of Investigation, India's top criminal agency. New investigators arrived. They listened, really listened, for the first time. They found witnesses. They exhumed evidence buried by corruption and fear. They pieced together the truth, thread by thread, from a world that had tried to bury it. They built a case, stubborn and careful, against men who believed they would never answer for what they'd done. In 2004, the Supreme Court stepped in, moving the trial hundreds of miles away to Mumbai to protect Bilkis from intimidation and retaliation. It was a landmark moment, the first time a riot-related case had been shifted out of Gujarat's courts. For Bilkis, it meant something simple but enormous, a chance that maybe, just maybe, the truth could still matter. The trial dragged on for years. Each day in court picked at the scars she was still trying to cover. The defense tried everything: delays, accusations, character smears, painting Bilkis not as a survivor but as a liar. She sat through it all, eyes steady. Her voice didn't break, not even once. On January 21st, 2008, 6 years after the attack, the verdict came. 11 men were found guilty. Guilty of gang rape, guilty of murder, guilty of crushing a family and trying to erase it from the earth. Life sentences were handed down, and for the first time in a very long time, Bilkis allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't a victory, it would never be a victory, but it was something that looked just faintly like justice. For 14 years, Bilkis Bano lived quietly. She raised her child, away from the cameras, away from the crowds, holding onto a fragile, hard-won peace. Every day, she tried to patch together something that resembled a life. She believed the worst was behind her. Then, in 2022, everything changed. Without warning, without even informing her, the Gujarat government approved the early release of the 11 men convicted in her case. Officially, they called it good behavior, but unofficially, there were whispers of pressure, of politics, of decisions made far away from the courtroom where Bilkis had once fought so hard to be heard. August 15th, 2022, India's Independence Day. While the nation celebrated freedom, those who had destroyed her family walked free. They didn't lower their eyes. They didn't offer a single word of regret. Instead, garlands, flowers placed around their necks, sweets pressed into their hands, as if they were returning war heroes. Videos of their release spread like wildfire. Bilkis watched, stunned, helpless, as the justice she had fought for was undone in front of the whole world. At that moment, she wasn't just wounded, she was erased. Her pain, her survival, her voice, swept aside like an afterthought. The country trembled with anger. Human rights groups held protests across the country. Former judges, lawyers, activists all condemned the move. They called it a betrayal, not just of Bilkis, but of every survivor who had ever dared to believe the system might protect them. Questions flooded the airwaves. How could men convicted of such horror be rewarded with freedom? What message did this send to survivors, to women, to the very idea of justice? Outside, voices rose louder each day, but inside the halls of power, there was only silence. Bilkis didn't rush to the cameras. She didn't call for boycotts. She did what she had always done, quietly, painfully. She prepared to fight again. In November 2022, she filed a petition before the Supreme Court, not just for herself, but for the idea that verdicts must mean something. That when a court says guilty, it cannot be undone by a signature on a form. She asked the highest court in the land to hear her, to say publicly and without hesitation that some mistakes are too deep, too brutal to ever be forgiven. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for the right to exist in a country that had once promised her protection and nearly broke her trying to keep it. By early 2023, Bilkis Bano's petition had wound its way through the crowded dockets of India's highest court. Months had passed, papers filed, arguments made. Protests are quiet, not because people stopped caring, but because the waiting wore everyone thin. For Bilkis, every delay felt like a fresh wound. Every extension, every postponement whispered a dangerous possibility that her case might simply be forgotten. But she waited, quietly, patiently, like she had done once before when the world tried to erase her and she refused to let them. On January 8th, 2024, the Supreme Court delivered its decision. The court ruled that the Gujarat government, the very body that had freed her attackers, had no legal authority to grant their release. Only the Maharashtra government, where the trial was held, had that power, which meant, simply and devastatingly, the remission was illegal. The men were ordered back to prison within 2 weeks, or face arrest. For Bilkis, it wasn't just a technical victory. It was a rare, defiant statement in a world too often deaf to survivors. A recognition, official and absolute, that what happened to her mattered. That justice wasn't supposed to be a door that could swing open and shut, depending on politics. Outside the court, cameras flashed. Journalists scrambled for statements. Supporters cried and cheered. But Bilkis, she stayed away from the spotlight. She issued a short statement, measured, steady, thanking those who stood beside her. She spoke of faith and hope, and the long, painful journey back to dignity. She didn't speak about revenge. She didn't speak about triumph, because Bilkis understood something deeper, something most headlines missed. There are wounds that even justice cannot fully heal. There are losses too deep for any verdict to erase. But there is power, immense, unbreakable power, in refusing to be silenced. Power in standing back up when every part of you has been told to stay down. For the second time in her life, Bilkis Bano did not let the world write her ending for her. She wrote it herself, in quiet words, in steady steps, in the simple, radical act of surviving. And through her, through the sheer endurance of her spirit, the meaning of justice was not lost. It was rewritten. There are stories that end with verdicts, guilt, innocence, sentence served, justice, neat and clean, delivered by the weight of law. But then there are stories like Bilkis Bano's, stories that refuse to fit inside courtrooms and headlines, stories that refuse to be forgotten, in silence, in memory, in the stubborn act of survival. Bilkis didn't ask for the life she was given. She didn't choose to become a symbol. All she wanted was to live, to raise her child, to build something that couldn't be taken away. And yet, through the cruelty she endured, through the battles she fought, she became something extraordinary. Not because she wanted to, but because she refused to disappear. Her fight reminds us that justice is not a moment. It's not a headline. It's a fight carried in the body, in the breath, in the endless, exhausting choice to keep standing, when standing feels impossible. Some victories don't come with celebrations. Some victories are stitched together quietly. From pain, from persistence, from refusing to let the world pretend it never happened. Bilkis Bano's story is not just hers anymore. It belongs to every survivor who has ever been asked to forget, to every voice that was told to stay silent, to every person who chooses again and again to believe that dignity can be fought for and won, and maybe that is the truest kind of justice. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If you believe in stories that refuse to be forgotten, subscribe to True Crime O'Clock and stay with us for more true stories that matter. The next story is already waiting to be told. Thank you for watching.